Alright YouTube, some time ago I made a video about Detroit, how it was falling apart and why, and that it was now fucking itself into irrelevancy with their bankruptcy proceedings. Things are getting worse in Detroit now, however, because the water services in Detroit that service hundreds of thousands of people are now cutting off drinking water to 150,000 residents. There's a link in the description to this story. Now, part of me says that, and these people are now petitioning the UN to declare this, basically a human rights disaster. Part of me is not unsympathetic to their claim, because drinking water, I mean, come on, people can't live without drinking water. You're living in a city, you don't have access to, a clean, pure stream out back to get your water from. You're certainly not collecting the smog-filtered rain and drinking that, although drinking rainwater in this country for some reason is illegal, probably to keep people paying at the federal teat for their water. So part of me is not unsympathetic, because you can't live without drinking water, especially in a metropolitan area where there is no clean water source other than, well, semi-clean water source other than the water you get from the city. It's heavily pumped with fluoride and other chemicals, and it's probably got all sorts of leaks. You see some of these buildings, they have water literally gushing out of them. It's actually flooded some of these buildings because these pipes aren't being maintained and they just burst in the winter and spray water everywhere. So it's an incredibly inefficient system anyway. I'm surprised they're not broke. But you can't live without drinking water of some source that's at least marginally safe to drink. But the other part of it is that Detroit is so insolvent and run by people with so many bad ideas and who are so short on good ideas that it's not really surprising that people would be delinquent in their payments to begin with. Because, I mean, the city of Detroit keeps asking for more money, and what does it do? It builds sports stadiums. Instead of investing in training their population to make them employable, because a third of the city is functionally illiterate, and that's something that we learned not long ago. Instead of investing in training and education and maintaining those pipes that keep freezing and bursting, or the roads, or even getting rid of delinquent structures that are completely abandoned and falling down anyway and keep getting burned up every Halloween on Devil's Night or whatever they call it, instead of doing that, they build sports stadiums. Now, a sports stadium can bring some revenue to a city potentially, but you also have to spend the money to build it. And I don't think that the people in Detroit, in their city council, quite understand this fact, that you are probably going to spend more than you're going to make down the road anyway, because Detroit's completely insolvent, falling apart, and you don't have a domestic population willing to pay the money to actually go to any sporting events. These people are demoralized and penniless, largely, to the point where even the middle class, so-called, in Detroit, is probably living below the poverty line. What you would consider the median income for someone living within the city limits of Detroit is what anywhere else would be considered severely impoverished. And the reason for this, the left and the right keep blaming symptoms rather than the actual disease. The right wing keeps talking about pensions. The pensions are draining the city's reserves. The pensions are keeping them broke. The left wing keeps blaming a combination of white flight and capitalism. Oh, all the educated white people left because they were so scared of the blacks. They were so horribly racist, even though people were rioting at the time and shooting one another on a regular basis, and it's not surprising that people with the means moved out. And yet they blame race for it, as though it would have been any different if it had been white people rioting and shooting each other and beating up on other groups. And capitalism, they say, well, the businesses moved overseas, even though it was partially, the Democratic Party's fault that they did, and the Republicans too. Nobody seems to care about U.S. industry anymore. But these are symptoms. The disease is that Detroit was built as a manufacturing center, an industrial powerhouse, basically a gigantic factory, right on the shores of the Great Lakes. It had access to Great Lakes trade in a time period in which shipping parts and shipping vehicles and shipping industrial goods over water was cheaper than doing it in other manners. And it had massive rail access and a central location. It could ship goods to the coasts and to the south and into Canada relatively inexpensively. That's why Detroit happens to have been chosen as this massive manufacturing metropolis, once called the Paris of the United States. That was the reason. The problem is the United States industry moved to the coasts because they realized it was actually cheaper, because most of the goods and parts are either being imported or exported from the country. Well, then it makes sense to put your factories on the Pacific or Atlantic coast. It doesn't make sense to put them in the middle of the country when most of the people in the country aren't consuming domestic goods. They're consuming things from China and India and Japan and places like that. So it doesn't make any sense to have a manufacturing center in the center of the country. And that is the disease. The symptoms are the pensions. The symptoms in the pensions, the low literacy rate, people leaving the city, high crime, all of these other problems, low tax revenue, infrastructure is slowly crumbling, abandoned buildings, all of the symptoms that you see are the result of the industry drying up, because that's where most of the jobs in Detroit, that's what they pertain to. It was a manufacturing center. It was an industrial powerhouse. And we have the same problem where people on the left and the right can't come to any solid common sense agreement on how to solve the problem. We have the same problem with what they're blaming as we do with their proposed solutions. The left has the right idea when they talk about investing in training and education. That's good. That's a good idea. I would agree with that because, again, part of the population, a large proportion, is illiterate. They would require training and education. The right-wing solution is deregulate and privatize. Again, I agree with this. That would be a good step in the right direction. However, both sides ignore the good ideas on the other, because only when these two things are combined will you have any measurable good result. Imagine for a second, let's imagine these scenarios. Let's imagine the left has their way. Let's imagine the Democrats take over Detroit entirely, fuck up the city council, and implement their training program. That's great. The problem is now you have a literate, trained population, but you've still got high taxes and you've still got a massive burden where a lot of people are employed by the city directly and just wandering around being overpaid to do nothing. The problem is you now have workers, but you don't have jobs because nobody's going to move into an area that's completely crumbling where the infrastructure is gone and locate their business in a high crime area. They don't need to. There are plenty of other places in the country they can invest in. That would be seen as a high-risk investment. They're not going to do it. So the liberal plan falls short. Now let's imagine the conservatives gain total power, the Rand Pauls of the world, and they begin to deregulate and to privatize, to privatize and deregulate and drive down the taxes and pump it full of businesses. That's also a good thing. However, that proportion of the population that is already illiterate and untrained aren't going to benefit from those jobs. You're still going to have potentially 250,000 people that don't know how to read and write and have no prior job experience that are completely unemployable. You've just filled the city with decent jobs, but you've still got this derelict chunk of the population. What will happen? People will move into Detroit from other areas. They'll fill up those job roles. That will make the city potentially solvent. Yet you will still see high crime, high illiteracy, high unemployment persist. In neither situation, with the sort of singular ideas that have been formulated by the left and the right, does the city benefit at all. In one case, you do have a lot of good jobs, but you don't actually begin employing these derelict workers. And you're certain... Simply privatizing the city, by the way, isn't really going to help with all of these abandoned structures either, unless the government itself is willing to pay somebody to get them removed. The businesses themselves aren't going to invest in removing all of the abandoned structures near where they're actually setting up shop. It wouldn't make any sense for them to make the investment when they can just let the government do it instead and continue absorbing more taxpayer money, and the right wing hasn't made it clear how taxes would go down if they're still continuously having to expend funds to do so. Just like the left wing hasn't made it clear how simply educating people and bolstering infrastructure is going to cause jobs to move into an area which is notoriously high tax. Neither side makes sense. You have to drive down the taxes to attract businesses and deregulate and get businesses to absorb some of these jobs. But you also have to train and educate the population. You have to do both, otherwise the city remains either insolvent or insufferably miserable for the large proportion of the population that wouldn't even be serviced by those new jobs. So the left and the right wing both have good ideas, but they both miss the mark completely. My idea for how Detroit could become solvent first and foremost, you will need a massive expenditure, which would come partially from the city, partially from the state, and unfortunately partially from Joe taxpayer nationwide to prop it up. You would need to invest in a massive program to educate these unskilled individuals and give them skills. I mean, some people, they're illiterate because they dropped out, but they're not unintelligent, they're not stupid. They're capable of learning and being trained. They're not morons, they just didn't really get a chance. A Detroit school system obviously isn't, up to par by the standards of most of even the third world. Detroit resembles parts of the worst areas in Latin America or parts of more developed Africa when you really think about it. So first you begin educating those workers. Then you begin repairing the infrastructure. You start cleaning up, but this has to be concurrent. While you're making that investment, you have to at the same time drop the tax rate as low as you can possibly go while remaining at least partially solvent and attract those businesses. And I think the education of the population of Detroit would help to drive down crime, but until those jobs move in, you're going to have to keep giving them welfare. That's where the left's plan falls completely short. They're talking about this, we'll make the city more beautiful and we'll make people smarter. That's wonderful. If you give them that education, a lot of these people who benefit will simply move out of Detroit altogether. You're going to end up actually in the long run potentially with more abandoned structures and more investment needed. That's why you drive the taxes down. It seems strange. The idea of lowering taxes to increase revenue always sort of befuddles people on the left. They can't wrap their heads around how actually taking less money from people generates more income in the long run. What they don't seem to understand is that it creates jobs. It does. It's not trickle down. It's not, well, we're going to give a chunk of cash to the rich and hope the poor absorb some of that. I'm not talking about corporate welfare. I'm talking about simply allowing businesses which would otherwise never consider this location to move in. And this could be done in other insolvent areas. Jersey City is one good example. Jersey City has some of the same problems that Detroit has. It's basically Detroit light. Its crime rate is going up too. Its illiteracy and unemployment is also high. You could do the same thing. The problem is people go to New York for tourism. They're not going to cross the river and go poking around in Jersey City. They'd probably get shot if they did. And end up, thrown in the East River or something, depending on who kills them, whether it's the mafia or the CIA. Depends on which river they end up in, which is something that people surmise. Detroit's problems are not simply going to go away because you deregulate. And they're not simply going to go away because you get some Starbucks Marxists in there who say, well, we'll make the population appreciate art and we'll let them put their beautiful graffiti up everywhere and we'll give them community college courses. Neither side has a clue what they're doing, and their plans will fail. However, even those plans alone would be better than what's currently going on. What's currently going on is money's being thrown at Detroit left and right, and they keep building stadiums. Or they build a monorail that goes through an abandoned neighborhood. The City Council of Detroit is the most inept governing body, I believe, that has ever been on the face of the earth. Nero Caesar had a better breadth of how to run a city-state or a city or an empire or even a cabbage patch than these people in the Detroit City Council. They have failed at their job. They should all be removed from office under threat of federal force. Another thing that would help is declaring martial law in Detroit. Now, as a libertarian, I hate the idea of martial law, but when you have a scenario that's this unstable, where the actual city body now is depriving 150,000 people of drinking water, the government should step in. You can't simply allow people to wither away and die of thirst in a metropolitan area and consider yourself capable of leadership. It's a travesty. You don't simply deprive them of water. And the thing is, the amount that they're delinquent could be paid for by a fraction of the money that the Detroit City Council itself is using for these worthless new projects. Their monorail to nowhere, their massive new stadium overhaul, and all of the new government buildings. It's ridiculous. They're wasting money that's being given to them by the taxpayers of the country at large, because they're being given money by the government, by the state and the federal government, and they are misusing it. Detroit should be stripped entirely of its city council, and control of the city should be given to the federal government up until such a time that the city shows signs of at least improving marginally. And this again would seem strange to libertarians that I would suggest this. What would you suggest? I've just explained the sort of libertarian style plan of simply privatizing everything in the city cannot work unless you also combine that with investment in training and educating the domestic population. Otherwise, you retain a derelict population. And the left's plan is equally invalid, because training and educating these people without bringing jobs there will simply result in those that have taken advantage of these training programs leaving the city. It's elementary. Come on, a child could understand this. If I'm living in a city drawing welfare, government comes along and says, we're going to train you to be an engineer or a nurse, or they say we'll get you a bachelor's degree, or whatever they give me. And there's no job opportunities where I am, but now I'm trained. I'm going to take a job somewhere else. I don't care if I have to hitchhike halfway across the country. My future is going to be a lot brighter moving to some humdrum little suburban enclave outside of some other city where the taxes are probably lower, the crime's definitely lower, and I can get a job. I might even be above median income. I'll think that I'm sitting on top of the hill of victory with a crown on my head. And the right's plan would be equally doomed to fail. You can get all the jobs in the area you want, but if you have 250,000 people that are still unemployed, and most of them are also illiterate, you're going to retain high crime. The unemployment will remain high. You will still have large patches of the city that will be derelict. You'll have improved life for the majority of the population, but there will still be a rather large minority that's being underserved. Meanwhile, unless libertarians also took over the entire federal and state government, state of Michigan that is, and ran the city council, you're still going to be giving these people massive amounts of welfare, which is a lot more expensive than if you simply invested one time in training them and educating them so they can get actual jobs. If it's combined with job growing opportunities like low tax havens, pumped into Detroit, essentially making the city one zero tax area for these businesses, and not corporations, I'm talking small businesses as well. I would prop up a small business if I knew I didn't have to pay anything for 10 years. I'd move there too. I'd say, fuck, with taxes this low, I'll just move into one of these $2 houses, fix it up a little bit, and I'll just, hunker down there on an old mattress, and I'll be drawing a huge amount of money in because people will start pouring into the city. You can save Detroit. It would be a matter of less than a decade with a combined program of this style with far less investment than we've already thrown at Detroit because it's gone bankrupt. Tens and hundreds of millions of dollars get thrown at the city, and the city council just piddles it away on projects that don't work because the city council itself is composed of morons that were elected largely because they are just as moronic as the people that continually put these programs in place for decades and decades in the past on their city council and running the state of Michigan that have failed. Their programs failed completely. Detroit did not have to wither just because manufacturing dried up. There are other industries that could move into this area. The tech industry, if this was a low enough tax area, could theoretically branch out into Detroit, bringing hundreds of thousands of jobs. The problem being you have to educate people and have low taxes. Because it would be suicidal right now, no matter which side wins, it would be suicidal to move a business into Detroit. Your business would end up getting burned to the ground, or robbed repeatedly, or you simply wouldn't be able to find skilled workers. And no matter how many skilled workers you have, if you don't have jobs, they're just going to leave. It's elementary. It makes sense to anyone with 2 brain cells that still work can understand this concept that you have to have both jobs and skilled workers, or else people are moving out, working at McDonald's, or continuing to draw unemployment, because that's the way it's always been. So Detroit can be saved, but right now they're shutting off water to a large proportion of the city's population without explaining how these people are going to be prevented from leaving the city anyway. What happens if 150,000 people flee the city in the next month or two? What happens to Detroit? It gets completely crushed. There will be no city left. Everyone will flee, because you will have lost so many more people than have already fled that it will be a ghost town. The entire city will be abandoned. People will start going there with paintball guns and pretending that it's the world of Fallout 3 because it will look so post-apocalyptic. Which would be fun, but there are ways to save Detroit. And it doesn't even rely upon manufacturing as it traditionally did in the past. That's about all. Peace out.